While I was lying in the ICU, barely breathing, my daughter's in-laws changed the locks on my lake house. They said it was too big for a woman like me. I stood outside in the cold, holding my discharge papers, realizing I had nowhere to go. My heart didn't break because of the house. It broke because my daughter never showed up. But what they didn't know was I still had one quiet card left to play. And when I did, everything turned. I was never the kind of woman who needed a crowd to feel alive. Give me a quiet morning, black coffee, and the sound of loons rising off the lake, and I could breathe again. That's why I built everything around this place. My husband and I started the lake house with bare hands and borrowed hope. We planted trees together, fixed the dock every spring, and welcomed strangers from the city who came here just to feel something again. For 25 years, I ran our little eco-lodge without missing a season. The morning of the anniversary, I woke up before dawn. The guests were still sleeping. I set out a tray of honey cornbread and fresh jam, just like I used to when he was alive. The fireplace was warm, the brochures laid out for the ceremony later that day. I even pinned my name badge to my chest for the first time in years. Evelyn Connors, owner and steward. It felt proud. It felt right. Haley arrived just after 9, my only daughter. She came alone, no husband, no kids, just her phone, and that glazed-over look she always wore when she was multitasking. She kissed my cheek and told me I looked so peaceful, then took a call on the porch while I greeted the guests. I heard her say something about asset leverage and rural value opportunity. I didn't think much of it then. I didn't want to. By noon, the community hall by the lake was full. My friends brought pies, my neighbor played banjo. The mayor even gave a little speech about how our lake house had become a local treasure. I stood up, trembling just a bit, ready to thank everyone. But before I finished my first sentence, a tightness gripped my chest like a hand I couldn't shake off. The last thing I remember clearly was dropping the note cards I'd written. I saw them scatter across the floor. One landed face up near Haley's feet. She didn't move. When I woke up, the room was white, cold, humming. Tubes in my arms, an oxygen clip tight on my finger. The nurse said I'd been in the ICU for 9 days. 9 days. No visitors, no flowers, just a folded sweater on the side table and a sticky note. Call when discharged, Haley. And so I did. I didn't expect balloons, but I didn't expect silence either. Some of you might know that kind of silence. The kind that doesn't scream. It just weighs. Sits in the corner of the room and dares you to breathe through it. That was the day I realized something had changed. Not just in my body, but in the way the world saw me. In the way my daughter saw me. And still, I had no idea what was waiting for me once I came home. 2 days after I was discharged, I called Haley like the note said. She picked up on the third ring. Her voice clipped, like she was in the middle of something. I told her I was ready to come home. She said she had already arranged for a ride to pick me up. No small talk. No how are you feeling. Just logistics. The car that showed up wasn't hers. It was a black SUV I didn't recognize, driven by a young man who said almost nothing the entire way. He didn't take me to the main driveway of my lake house either. He stopped near the bottom of the hill and told me this was as close as he was told to go. Told. That word stayed with me. I walked up the gravel path with my overnight bag in one hand and my discharge papers in the other. When I reached the porch, the welcome mat was gone. So was the planter I used to keep by the front door. Instead, there was a new keypad lock. No keyhole, just a blinking red light and a quietness that didn't belong to my home. I knocked once. Nothing. Again. Still nothing. Then the door opened just a crack. Beverly Vaughan stood behind it, dressed in my old windbreaker and holding a mug that used to sit in my kitchen cabinet. She looked at me like I was the one trespassing. She opened the door a little wider and said they weren't expecting me so soon. I told her this was my home. She said Haley had told them I was recovering in a rehab center in Albany and wouldn't be back for a while. I stepped inside, or tried to. Beverly didn't move. Her body filled the doorway, just enough to block me without looking aggressive. It was subtle, strategic. I had worked with people like her back in the days when I negotiated land permits for conservation sites. Polite control, that was the tactic. She finally let me pass, but not before she reminded me that she and Robert had spent the last 10 days keeping the place from falling apart. She mentioned frozen pipes and an electrical short in the back kitchen, and how lucky it was they had stayed when they did. The inside looked familiar, but off. My rocking chair was gone. The bookshelves had been rearranged. The framed photo of my husband and me by the fireplace was missing. Instead, there was a decorative wooden plaque that read, "The Vaughan Family Retreat." In the kitchen, Robert was on a call. He waved without looking at me. There were blueprints on the table. I glanced down. The header read, Phase 1 Development, Retreat, Renovation Timeline. When Haley arrived 20 minutes later, she acted surprised to see me standing there. She gave me a hug that didn't touch either of us and started explaining how overwhelmed she'd been with everything. She said Beverly and Robert had stepped in to help, and things had gotten busy, but they were just trying to keep it all from slipping. Then she said something I didn't expect. She told me the house had become too much for me to manage, that she'd been meaning to talk to me about options. Her tone was gentle, practiced. It had the same cadence she used to use on her son when trying to convince him to share his toys. I said nothing, because something in me had already shifted. It wasn't just the locks, or the missing picture, or the new plaque. It was the way they looked at me now, like I was a guest, a problem to work around, an old woman who had wandered into the wrong place at the wrong time. And I wasn't sure yet what hurt more, the silence or how familiar it felt. The next morning I came down early. The kitchen, once quiet and still in the early light, now had voices. Beverly was sitting at my breakfast table, scrolling on her tablet, sipping from another one of my mugs. Haley stood by the sink, speaking low into her phone, talking about square footage optimization and site approval forms. She paused when she saw me, smiled as if everything was normal, and went back to her call. I opened the pantry. Rows of unfamiliar protein powders and imported teas had replaced the preserves I used to make. My jars of wildflower honey were gone. In their place sat plastic bins labeled with stickers. Robert's handwriting, neat and deliberate. No one asked if I wanted breakfast. No one seemed to notice when I stepped outside onto the porch and looked out at the lake. The dock had been pressure washed, probably by some company they hired. It looked sterile, lifeless. The bird feeders were gone. Later that day, a couple in business attire showed up. They were introduced to me as potential partners. Beverly said they were exploring ideas for converting the lodge into a boutique retreat. She used words like expansion, seasonal bookings, and long-term growth. Haley nodded along, quiet but complicit. Her silence was no longer passive. It was working in sync with Beverly's words. I stayed silent. I watched. I smiled when spoken to. I said I was still recovering. But I was watching everything. That evening, I went to the guest bedroom they had set up for me. It was smaller than the others, tucked away near the back. A cot, a folded blanket, and a tray table with a small lamp. My room, the one with the bay window and cedar chest, had been converted into a meeting space. There was a new flat-screen TV on the wall and a coffee station set up in the corner. The cedar chest was gone. I asked about it once, quietly. Beverly said it had been taken to storage to make room for a more flexible layout. Haley avoided eye contact. I opened my phone and looked at my photos. A picture of the chest was still there, taken 3 summers ago, when my grandson had climbed on top of it to look out the window and called it a storyboat. I didn't delete it. That night, I didn't sleep. I lay there listening to the faint sounds of voices down the hallway, plans being made, schedules being sorted. I heard Haley laugh once, a soft, short laugh I hadn't heard in years. Not with me, at least. The next morning, I found a printed brochure draft on the kitchen counter. The header read, Vaughan Retreat at Pine Lake. Below it was a digitally edited photo of the lodge. My name had been removed from the signage. My husband's name, which had always been carved into the wood just under the welcome sign, was no longer there. The plaque had been replaced. They hadn't just moved into my space. They had begun to erase me from it. I folded the brochure and put it in my coat pocket. I didn't cry. I didn't scream. I didn't say a word. But I knew then that I had already lost something I might never get back. Not just the house, not even my daughter. It was something quieter, like watching the sun go down and realizing the stars don't look the same anymore. Not because they changed, but because the place you're standing doesn't feel like home. The following Monday, I waited until the house was empty. Robert had gone to meet a contractor in town. Beverly was off somewhere for a wellness appointment. Haley said she had a lunch meeting, though she didn't say with whom. I stayed behind, offering to fold towels and answer the phone in case guests called. No one questioned it. No one really looked at me anymore. Once the front door closed, I moved quietly. I checked the drawers in the kitchen first. The old recipe box where I used to keep my savings notes was gone. The junk drawer, once full of flashlights and fishing line, now held glossy pamphlets and expense spreadsheets. I opened the utility cabinet near the back staircase. Tucked behind a row of light bulbs and canned beans, I found a banker's folder marked with Haley's initials. Inside was a property tax assessment, with my name crossed out in pencil and Vaughan Group Holdings written in the margin. I paused. My name, crossed out. It didn't hurt the way I expected. It just settled deep, like sediment, thick and quiet. I folded the paper, slid it into my coat pocket, and kept going. In the office, I found a drawer that had been locked. I knew the trick to it. My husband had installed that lock after a summer guest once tried to snoop. You had to press the top left corner while turning the handle. The drawer clicked open. Inside were more folders. Financial documents, some with my signature copied. Too clean, too recent. A few dated just days after my heart attack. One document listed Beverly as a temporary caretaker of assets. Another had a clause about medical incapacity, with Haley named as power of attorney. My hands were still. I wasn't shocked. I wasn't even angry, just tired. Tired in a way that came from being seen as weak long enough for other people to start planning what to take from you. I took only one folder, the one with the notary stamp on the bottom. I slipped it under my cardigan and went out the back door, past the shed and toward the walking trail that led to the main road. I didn't want anyone to see me leaving. Not yet. At the end of the road sat a small post office and a bait shop. I bought a bottle of water to keep up appearances and asked the young man behind the counter if the Wi-Fi still worked. He said yes. I sat at the picnic table out back and opened my phone. I emailed the documents to myself, then to someone else. His name was Reed Mueller. He had been my husband's lawyer for over 20 years. We hadn't spoken in nearly a decade, not since the estate was finalized. But I remembered his direct line. I also remembered how he looked me in the eye when he said, "You built this life too, Evelyn. Don't forget that." I included one sentence with the files, just a quiet request to meet. That night, when I returned, Haley asked where I had gone. I said I took a walk. She didn't ask anything more. But Beverly watched me from the hallway. She said nothing. Her eyes followed me as I passed. In the guest room, I sat on the cot and opened the folder one last time. I looked at the signatures, the dates, the faint impression of my name reshaped to fit someone else's plan. I knew then that this wasn't a misunderstanding. This was a decision. And the difference between those two things changes everything. The next afternoon, I walked into town under the pretense of picking up tea from the co-op. No one noticed. Beverly had a clipboard and a contractor in the sunroom. Haley was pacing the deck with her phone pressed tight to her ear. Robert had driven into the city for another zoning consult. I kept my pace slow, my breath steady, and my folder tucked inside a reusable grocery bag. The office hadn't changed. Same chipped brick, same brass plaque. Inside, the receptionist looked up and blinked once. I said my name softly. She stood without a word and disappeared down the hallway. Reed Mueller opened the door himself. He looked older, thinner than I remembered, but his eyes still held that quiet steel, the kind that made people second-guess their schemes. He didn't say much at first. He just gestured toward a worn leather chair, and I sat. I laid the folder on the table between us and opened to the notarized page. He scanned it, his mouth tightening. Then the next page. Then the one with the signature. When he looked up, there was no hesitation in his voice. He told me I'd done the right thing. What I had suspected was worse than I thought. The forms weren't just shady. They were legally questionable. Some portions were altered. Initials looked forged. One page referenced a trust I had never heard of, listed under the Vaughan name, with my house listed as the primary asset. I felt no rage, no panic, just a long, cold thread of clarity winding through my chest. Reed leaned back and asked what I wanted. I told him I didn't want to sue anyone. I didn't want a courtroom. I wanted silence, precision, protection. Something that wouldn't just reverse what they'd done, but redefine it. He nodded once. Then he pulled out a legal pad and began writing. We spent the next hour working through options. A grantor trust could be established under my name. The property could be moved back into my control with provisions. A conservation easement, perhaps. One that protected the land from development indefinitely. He asked about my will. I told him it was simple. It named Haley years ago. He suggested we amend it. Not for punishment, for clarity. By the time I left, the bag was lighter. But something in me felt heavier and steadier at once. On the way back, I stopped at the lake overlook. The sky was the kind of grey that hints at snow. The water was still. I watched a single loon glide across the far end. My husband used to say they only stayed when the place still felt like home. I got back just before dusk. Inside, the mood had shifted. The dining table was set with place cards. Haley had pulled out my china. Beverly was arranging pine cones in a centerpiece. Robert's voice carried from the next room, talking about timelines and Phase 2 plans. I moved through them like smoke, invisible but present. In the kitchen, I poured myself tea. Haley joined me, placing a hand on my shoulder. She said the investors were coming that weekend, that everything was finally coming together. She said she hoped I could see that this was all for the best. I nodded. Then I asked if I could take my tea on the porch. She smiled, already distracted. I stepped outside, cup warm in my hands, and sat in the rocker they had pushed against the far wall. The sun dipped behind the trees, casting the lake in bronze. I closed my eyes. Inside, voices rose, laughter, clinking glasses, movement. But out there, under the fading light, I felt something settle. I wasn't just back. I was awake. 2 days later, I found myself standing in the garden, pruning the dried hydrangeas I once planted with my husband. They hadn't bloomed properly in years, but I kept tending them, out of habit more than hope. That morning, Beverly had announced they would be tearing out the garden beds to make room for guest meditation circles. Her voice was cheerful, final, like a decision had already been signed and sealed. I nodded and said I'd clean the beds myself. She barely looked up from her tablet. While I worked, a slim envelope slipped from my jacket pocket. It was from Reed, his handwriting, clean and even. Inside were 2 copies of the updated trust paperwork. My name, my terms, my land. The final signatures would be delivered in person, through a courier, later that week. Back inside, I kept quiet. I moved through the house like I always had, soft, slow, deliberate. I made coffee, I folded towels. I organized the pantry the way I used to, knowing full well Beverly would rearrange it again. But I wasn't doing it for her. I was doing it to remember myself. That night, I stood at the window by the stairwell and watched Haley in the driveway. She was walking with one of the investors, someone from the city. He laughed, shook her hand, and pointed at the lake like he already owned it. Haley nodded, arms crossed, confidence in every step. It wasn't the daughter I had raised, but maybe it was the version she thought the world needed. When they walked inside, I greeted them politely and left the room. I didn't ask what they discussed. I didn't press. I had already begun setting something larger in motion. Upstairs, I sorted through the last of my old boxes. I found a faded letter from the town council dated 15 years ago. It was the original permit I filed to register our land as a wildlife preservation site. I had forgotten I even kept it, but there it was, with my signature, stapled to the back of a property survey map, and a letter from the local environmental foundation. I folded them carefully and placed them beside Reed's envelope. Then I slipped a note inside. Just 2 lines. Let them keep building. They'll never own the ground beneath it. That night, at dinner, Beverly made a toast. She praised family resilience and the courage it took to turn something old into something new. Haley clinked glasses and thanked everyone for supporting the vision. I raised my water glass and smiled. The moment passed like fog over the lake. Soft. Almost nothing. But I felt something shift beneath the surface. Not in them, in me. And I knew what would come next. Quiet as moss, sure as sunrise, not a battle, not a storm, just a slow reclaiming of what had always been mine. The day the courier arrived, the air had that dry crispness that only comes before the first snow. I was alone on the porch, sipping coffee from a chipped mug they hadn't thrown out yet. The sound of tires crunching on gravel made me lift my head. A man stepped out, polite and efficient. He asked for my signature, handed me a sealed envelope, and left just as quickly. No ceremony, no questions, just a quiet transaction, the kind I had grown to prefer. Inside the envelope were 2 things. First, the fully executed trust paperwork. Everything was now official. My property had been moved into a conservation trust under my sole control, bound legally to protect the land from any form of development or commercial repurposing. No expansions, no boutique hotels, no Vaughan family retreat. Second, there was a certified copy of my new will, drafted with Reed's help, naming a foundation as my heir. A foundation that would preserve the lake house for educational retreats and environmental programs. Not 1 cent would go to Haley or her new partners. Not because I wanted revenge, but because I finally understood what kind of legacy I wanted to leave behind. That evening, the kitchen buzzed with noise. Beverly was directing catering staff. Robert barked orders on speakerphone. Haley was in the corner, reviewing what looked like an event agenda. They were preparing for the investors' welcome dinner. I moved past them unnoticed, went to the back hallway, and slipped the documents into the drawer I had unlocked weeks ago. The drawer they never checked. I stood there for a long moment, breathing in the lavender oil Beverly always diffused in the vents. The air didn't smell like home anymore, but I didn't need it to. Not now. Just before dinner, I stepped outside again. The lake shimmered under a pale orange sky. I sat on the bench my husband built, the one they kept saying they would refinish, but never did. I ran my fingers along the weathered grain of the wood. I thought about what it meant to let go of what you once tried so hard to hold together, not in defeat, in clarity. I came inside just as guests began arriving, strangers in tailored coats and polished boots, laughing, shaking hands. I smiled at each of them. I knew that smile was the last thing they would expect from me. Dinner unfolded in the great room, the fire glowing, music soft in the background. Haley stood and gave a speech about transformation and vision. Beverly handed out mock-up brochures. Robert passed around sparkling cider. They were already talking about Phase 2. I didn't interrupt. I sat quietly, listening, nodding when appropriate. Then, after the plates were cleared and the dessert was served, I stood. My voice wasn't loud. It didn't need to be. The room quieted because of the way I stood, still, steady. I thanked everyone for coming. I said I hoped they enjoyed the evening. And then, without raising my voice, I mentioned that the land had recently been placed under legal protection, that any future changes or plans would now require board approval from the newly established trust. I smiled again, calm and sure. Haley froze, fork halfway to her mouth. Robert blinked, confused. Beverly's fingers tightened around her wineglass. I didn't explain further. I simply said I hoped they would continue to treat the space with the care and respect it had always deserved. Then I sat down. The rest of the evening moved slowly. Stiff conversations. Guests excused themselves early. The room grew cold, though the fire never went out. Later that night, I heard the front door close harder than usual. A muffled argument in the hallway. A door slammed. And I lay in bed, finally feeling what I had waited months to feel. Not vindication, peace. By morning, the kitchen was quiet. The usual clatter of pans, the low thrum of Beverly's voice on a call, Robert's laptop clicks. All of it had gone still. I poured myself coffee and sat at the table alone. Across from me, the brochure with the words Vaughan Retreat lay face down. No one had touched it since the night before. Outside, the lake was still. A thin frost edged the glass. I pulled my shawl tighter and watched the silence settle into every corner of the house. Silence like that only comes after something breaks. Haley came down around 8. Her hair was pulled back tight, her face drawn. She didn't say good morning. She didn't look at me. She moved toward the cabinet, took out a cup, then stopped. The mug she had reached for was mine, the one with the pine trees and faded lettering that read, "Still waters run deep." She held it a moment too long, then put it back and took a plain one instead. She poured her coffee in silence, then leaned against the counter. I waited. Finally, she asked if I had meant to embarrass them in front of their guests. I told her no. Then I reminded her the land had always been mine, that I had cared for it long before she knew how to walk, that I had protected it through drought, debt, and grief, and that what I had done the night before wasn't about punishment. It was about protection. She didn't respond. Her eyes stayed fixed on the mug in her hand. Her lips parted once, like she wanted to say something, but the words never came. Later that day, I heard Beverly speaking sharply on the phone in the study. She said phrases like loss of investor confidence and misleading documentation. Robert stormed out twice. Haley stayed upstairs most of the day. I stayed out of the way, in the garden, clipping what was left of the lavender before snow set in. That evening, I prepared a small stew and set the table for myself. I didn't expect anyone to join. They didn't. But just as I finished cleaning up, I found a note folded beside the kitchen sink. It was from Haley. Just one sentence, written in her familiar handwriting. I didn't know how far they were willing to go. No apology, no excuse. But something in those 8 words held weight. She knew now. Not everything, but enough. That night, I slept soundly. The next day, Reed called to confirm that the trust documents had been logged and finalized. He also let me know the conservation group had posted the new boundary signage around the property. Discreet markers, but legally binding. They had already filed the updated zoning exemptions with the county clerk. Later that afternoon, a car came to take Beverly and Robert to the airport. They didn't say goodbye. I watched from the upstairs window as they loaded their bags. Robert slammed the trunk harder than necessary. Beverly never turned around. I stayed quiet. After they left, Haley walked into the great room, stood at the fireplace, and just stared. I joined her after a few minutes. Neither of us spoke. There was nothing left to explain. I handed her a folded paper, a copy of the brochure they had made, now with red ink across the front. Withdrawn. She held it for a long time, then folded it again. I didn't ask her what she would do next. That was hers to figure out. But I knew what I would do. I stepped out into the cold, boots crunching on frost, and walked down to the dock. I stood there alone, wind at my back, watching the trees shift along the lake's edge. And for the first time in months, I let myself breathe without bracing for what might come next. The following week unfolded like early snow, soft, quiet, and not without weight. Each morning I made my coffee and sat by the window that overlooked the lake. I began to move through the house again, not like a guest, not like a ghost, but like someone reclaiming each step. I put my books back on the shelf in the hallway. I returned the quilts to the cedar chest I had asked Reed's assistant to retrieve from storage, and I unpacked the old brass clock that used to sit on the mantel before Beverly replaced it with a glass sculpture shaped like a sail. Haley stayed, but something in her had shifted. She kept to herself, mostly upstairs, moving more quietly than before. I didn't push her to talk. There was too much unsaid to untangle in a single day, or even a week. Instead, I focused on something else. I began to prepare a dinner, not for them, for the women in town who used to come up every November for the end-of-season gathering. Women I hadn't seen since before my heart attack, since before my house had become someone else's vision board. I made the calls one by one. At first there was hesitation, then one by one, they said yes. That Friday I spent the day in the kitchen. I pulled out the cast-iron Dutch oven that had sat boxed away. I simmered cider on the stove with cinnamon sticks and cloves. I baked cornbread from the recipe on the note card that still smelled like flour and thyme. I moved slowly, not because I was tired, but because it mattered. By 6 o'clock, the house glowed. Not with chandelier lighting or scented candles, but with warmth. Real warmth. A fire in the hearth. Worn linens, voices that carried the weight of memory. They came in with light steps and heavy coats, arms full of pies and preserves. They hugged longer than they used to. One of them cried softly when she saw the quilts folded across the chairs again. We ate. We laughed. We remembered. Haley did not join us. But at one point, I saw her standing in the hallway just outside the arch, a mug in her hands, watching. She didn't come closer, but she didn't walk away either. After everyone had gone, I stayed up late, rinsing dishes, drying them one by one. The kitchen was quiet again, but it was a different kind of quiet. It felt whole. That night, I left the porch light on. The next morning, I found a note slid under my bedroom door. Haley's handwriting. This time, longer. It said she would be leaving the next day, that she needed time, that she had a lot to think about. She didn't ask for forgiveness, but she said thank you. Thank you for not humiliating her. Thank you for protecting what mattered. Thank you for not closing the door completely. I read the note 3 times before I folded it and placed it in the drawer beside my bed. When I came down to the kitchen, she was already gone. Just a clean counter, her mug in the sink, the same one with the pine trees she had once avoided. The dock was empty, the road was clear, and the stillness that followed didn't feel like loss. It felt like breathing room, like the space something needs before it becomes something else. And maybe, just maybe, that was a kind of beginning too. 3 days after Haley left, the weather turned. Heavy snow rolled in overnight, blanketing the lake house in a silence that felt absolute. I woke to the pale hush of white light slipping through the curtains and knew, without checking, that the road would be closed until the plows came. But I didn't mind. I had no plans to be anywhere else. The rooms felt bigger somehow, even with the snow pressing in from outside. I moved through them slowly that morning, lighting candles, warming cider, setting down old photographs where they used to sit before everything had been boxed up or pushed aside. I found a picture of me and my husband, taken by the dock the first summer we opened the guest house. My hair was tied back with a scarf. His hand rested gently on my shoulder. We looked younger, not because of age, but because we still believed people would always show you who they truly were. That belief had changed, but I wasn't bitter. By noon, I was sorting through files again, this time with a clear goal. Reed had sent over one final batch of legal documents. It was time to sign the last paperwork to finalize the transfer of the education partnership with the Conservation Center. They would begin using the property during off-season months for small workshops, botany, writing, wildlife restoration. The land would no longer be reduced to marketing copy or mock-up retreats for investors. It would live, and it would serve. I signed the papers by the window, ink steady, hand calm. As I sealed the envelope, a memory rose without warning. Haley, about 9 years old, crouched in the dirt beside me in that very garden. She was digging with her bare hands, planting bulbs I had picked out the weekend before. Her cheeks were streaked with mud, her smile full of pride as she patted down the soil. She had asked if flowers remembered who planted them. I had told her yes. That night, I brought out my old journal, the one I had stopped writing in after my heart attack. I turned to a blank page and began writing, not about what had been done to me, but about what I had reclaimed. My land, my name, my peace. Not all at once, but piece by piece, like rebuilding a path you once lost in the woods. Around midnight, the power flickered. The wind howled against the glass, and snow pushed hard against the doors. But the fire held. The house, old as it was, stood steady. just like it always had when storms came. I stood at the bay window in my room and looked out over the lake. It was frozen now, smooth and silver under the moonlight. I could see the outline of the dock, barely visible beneath the drifts. Somewhere beyond the trees, a loon called once. The sound pierced through the wind and faded into stillness. That sound had always meant one thing to my husband. The lake was holding steady through the cold. And so was I. The next morning, I left the signed documents by the mailbox in a waterproof bag for Reed's courier. Then I sat on the porch with a hot drink wrapped in both hands and watched the snow melt slowly from the railing. Bit by bit, the edges softened, and in that quiet hour, I felt something I hadn't in a long time. Not triumph, not victory, just a calm, certain return to myself. A week later, the snow began to recede. The ploughs came through early in the morning, leaving behind salt lines and open roads. The house, once wrapped tight in silence, now breathed with a different rhythm. Not faster, not louder, just fuller. I spent my mornings by the kitchen window with a mug of warm broth, watching as birds returned to the feeder. Little flashes of colour against the white, the rhythm of seasons moving forward again, the way they always do when left alone. That afternoon, the mail arrived in a thick manila envelope from Reed's office. Inside was confirmation of the trust's funding. A final note from the foundation director welcomed the transition. It was done. Fully, legally, irrevocably. The house and surrounding land were now protected. Not only from Haley, but from anyone who might try to bend it to their will again. I sat at the dining table for a long while, reading the documents line by line, not because I didn't trust them, but because I wanted to feel each sentence as it passed through my hands. Every clause, every signature, was another thread I had pulled back into my grasp. I had not taken back the past, but I had reclaimed the future. Late in the afternoon, I bundled up and walked to the shed. It still smelled like old wood and rain. I opened the storage bin in the back corner and took out the crate of old guest journals. We had kept them for years. Visitors would leave entries after long weekends or short retreats, notes about the stars, the quiet, the meals shared at the long pine table. I had forgotten how many people had been touched by this place. I brought the crate back inside and began flipping through them by the fireplace. The handwriting varied: curvy cursive, block letters, some shaky with age, some careful like a child's. One entry caught me. A woman had written that the house gave her space to remember who she was before life got loud. I closed the journal and sat quietly for a long moment. As twilight came, the shadows stretched across the floor like old arms reaching for something familiar. I lit the lantern by the front steps and turned on the porch light. Not for guests, just because I always had. That evening, the phone rang once. Reed's assistant letting me know that a newspaper had reached out. They'd caught wind of the trust and the land transfer. They wanted a quote for a piece on land stewardship. I declined. Not because I feared publicity, but because some stories are better when they stay with the people who lived them. Before bed, I walked through each room slowly. The air inside was warmer now, not from the fire alone, but from the way the space had settled back into itself. Each corner felt like it belonged again. I stopped in the guest hallway, turned on the lamp, and ran my hand along the windowsill where I had once measured Haley's height in pencil marks. Faint now, almost erased, but still there. I didn't cry. I didn't linger. I simply stood still and allowed myself the full weight of that moment. Then I turned off the light and walked back to my room, steady as the lake beneath a frozen sky. The first spring rain came soft and slow. I heard it before I saw it, tapping gently on the kitchen roof as I brewed tea. The lake, still half covered in ice, shimmered under the grey sky. It was the kind of morning I used to love most, the kind that reminded me not everything beautiful had to be loud. I sat on the porch, wrapped in an old shawl, watching the trees sway. The pine branches glistened. Beneath them, the garden beds were still dormant, but I knew the daffodils would rise again. They always did. Later that day, I walked down to the dock with a notebook in hand. I had begun writing again. Not for anyone else, just for me. Bits and pieces, recipes I had once memorized, quotes I overheard from old guests, fragments of thought that drifted in during the quiet. I wrote about what it meant to be left behind, and then to stay anyway. About how silence was not always absence. Sometimes it was restoration. Near sunset, I heard a car approach, a soft crunch of gravel under tires. I looked up, but didn't rise. Haley stepped out, alone. She didn't carry bags, just a long coat and a small folder pressed to her chest. She saw me, paused, then walked down the path toward the dock. We didn't speak for a moment, just sat there together, like we once did, when she was a girl who still believed I knew everything. She handed me the folder. Inside were brochures, a revised proposal for the retreat center. Not on our land, but another property she had found nearby. She said she understood now why this place had to stay as it was, and that maybe she still wanted to build something, but without breaking what came before it. I nodded. There was no apology, no long explanation, just two women sitting on an old dock, the lake thawing, the world quieter. As the sky deepened into violet, I stood and walked back toward the house. Haley stayed behind, staring at the water. That night, I didn't feel like I had won or lost anything. I simply felt full, steady, and in some small way, healed. I climbed into bed and left the lamp on, just a little longer than usual. Tomorrow would come. But for tonight, this was enough. If you've ever felt like your voice was drowned out in your own home, or that the life you built was being rewritten without you, I hope this story reminded you that it's never too late to reclaim it. What would you have done in her place, or have you lived a version of this yourself?